Hello guys, and welcome back to another episode of the basics of ant keeping. In the previous episode, we talked about finding and raising a queen ant. If you didn't manage to catch it, I will leave a link for it down below in the description. But in today's episode, we will be talking about what to do when your queen has successfully raised her first workers. So it has been about 4 weeks since you acquired your first queen ant, and you are starting to notice that worker ants are emerging. In the wild, the first batch of workers will tunnel their way out of the founding chamber and to the surface. From there, they will start to gather food and bring it back to the nest. As an ant keeper, you will want to try and replicate this behaviour. Your young colony will still be nestled in their test tube, which is essentially their founding chamber. For the colony to gather food and bring it back to the nest, we will need to unplug the cotton bud out of the opening of the test tube. But before we do this, we need to prepare what's known as a foraging area, where your ants can safely gather food without escaping from your setup. Foraging areas can be as simple or as complicated as you like. You can merely have an empty plastic container or a landscape terrarium built to mimic your ant's natural environment. The choice is completely up to you. But a small word of warning: if you provide a foraging area with a layer of dirt, be careful not to make it too deep, as your ants will see this as a potential to dig, and this may cause them to move out of their test tube. I'd recommend keeping the depth of any added soil to about 1/2 centimetre. This will discourage your ants from digging and disappearing. Good examples of undiggable natural foraging areas are made out of grout. If you fancy making one, be sure to check out my grout foraging area tutorial. I will leave a link for it down below in the description. For this young colony, I will be giving them a simple empty container. I would always recommend this as a starting foraging area for all young colonies, as it is easier to keep an eye on them and clean up after them. To prepare the container, we firstly need to make sure it has sufficient airflow. You can do this in a number of ways. One method is by using a non-motorized micro hand drill. With this, you can poke tiny holes in the container lid. Obviously, you will want to pick a drill piece that is smaller than the width of the ant's body. Try and do as many holes in the lid as you can, as the more airflow, the better air quality your ants will have. If you want to check out the hand drill I am using here, I will leave a link for it in the description. Another method to create airflow is by simply scraping out a few large holes in the container lid with a pair of scissors. From here, you would plug the holes up with cotton buds to prevent the ants from escaping. This isn't the tidiest method, but it will still get the job done. After creating the ventilation holes for your foraging area, we now need to focus on escape prevention. As many of you might know, ants can walk quite well on vertical surfaces. This is a bit of an issue for an ant keeper when they want to open the lid of their foraging area to feed their ants. For escape prevention, you will need to coat some of these vertical surfaces in a slippery formula. This will ultimately prevent your ants from climbing up the lip of the container and escaping. There are a few good anti-escape formulas out there which you can buy from ant shops. You can simply Google ant escape prevention and multiple websites will pop up selling their own formulas. But if you feel like, hey, I'm not made of money, then here are a few home formulas you can conjure up yourself. The first one, and by far the easiest, is using Vaseline. This is a petroleum jelly-based product that you can coat around the lip of your container. This might just be me, but you can make this nice and neat by placing masking tape just under the lip before coating and then taking it off when finished. I will warn you though, Vaseline does not work for all ants, so this one may have to be a trial and error depending on what ants you have. Another more effective method for a home formula is mixing up baby powder and a liquid with a strong alcohol content. You can mix these together until they form a paste-like substance. Then you will want to coat it on the lip of the container, similar to the Vaseline. When this dries out, it will provide a solid defense against ant escape. Now, although there are many formulas for escape prevention, you are not always guaranteed 100% that your ants will not break out when the lid is off. So be sure to only take the lid off when you intend to feed or clean up after your ants. So your foraging area is now ready to house your young ant colony. Before you release them into their new habitat, you will need to ensure that they have sufficient number of workers. I would normally recommend waiting until you have around 4 workers before opening them up to the foraging area. This will replicate their natural behaviour in the wild, as ant colonies tend to wait until they have appropriate numbers in case they encounter a rival ant colony or threat. When you have reached a viable amount of workers, you can finally allow your colony to explore their new foraging area. To ensure they don't feel completely exposed, you can slide a piece of cut tissue down the opening of the test tube. If you want to make your ants feel even more comfortable, you can cover over their test tube so it stays nice and dark. But if you still fancy watching your ants in their test tube, whilst wanting them to feel comfortable, you can cover them over with a piece of clear red acetate. This is a great material as ants can't see the colour red, so to them it will remain dark. Now I would recommend giving your ants a couple of hours to settle into their new foraging area, as suddenly being exposed to a whole new world can be quite stressful. During this time it would be good to keep an eye on them, just to see if the holes you poke through the lid are small enough and that the anti-escape formula is working. After you have self-confirmed that the holes and escape prevention have worked and 2 hours have passed, you can now start to feed your ants. Now I am sure you have done this already, but you need to research the diet of your ants. You might be thinking, don't ants all eat the same thing? Well, not really. Some ants are gardeners, where they gather leaves, bring them back to the nest and use them to cultivate fungus, which they will eat. Other ants are harvesters, where they collect seeds, bring them back to the nest and mulch them into ant bread. So be sure to do your research. But for most ants, their diet is easily manageable and only really consists of insects and sugary liquids. So when feeding a young colony which relies solely on these two things, you want to be careful as to how much you feed them and how often. When feeding them insects, you will have to test the waters a little to see what they like. You can either pre-kill your insects and chop them up into movable pieces, or you can feed them live insects. If you are planning on feeding your ants live insects, be sure to purchase ones that are relatively small and have a soft body. Micro crickets that measure under ½ centimetre always make for a tasty snack. I don't recommend gathering insects from your garden to feed your ants, as they may be carrying foreign parasites that could be fatal to your young colony. But if that is your only option, you should boil the insects before feeding them to your ants. This will reduce the risk of any parasites invading your test tube. In terms of sugary liquids, you will once again have to test the waters to see what your ants prefer. You can try a few different mixtures like honey mixed with water or sugar mixed with water. You will want to give your ants a dish to drink this liquid from. There are a few different feeders you can buy from ant shops, which are worth checking out. But if you are on a budget, you can always use a pipette to pop a few tiny droplets in their foraging area. Just be sure to do this on something you can remove later, as you will want to reduce any chances of mold growth. When it comes to how often you feed your ants, I would recommend feeding them every 3 days. It is good to get into a routine of firstly removing any old uneaten insects and unfinished sugary liquids, and then adding some fresh sugary liquid and a couple of insects or piece of insects. At the end of the day, you should always test to see what specific foods your ants like, but most of them aren't too fussy, so you shouldn't have an issue feeding them. A problem you might run into with your current setup is that your test tube might run out of water, flood, or get mouldy. In this case, you will want to prepare a fresh test tube and place it next to the old one for your ants to slowly move into. If you don't know how to prepare a fresh test tube, be sure to watch the previous episode of the basics of ant keeping to see how to do this. So you have now successfully settled your young colony into their new foraging area, and they are now on their way to becoming a large and productive ant colony. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the basics of ant keeping, and as always, if you guys have any questions, just be sure to leave them down in the comments section below. Tune in to the next episode where we'll talk about what to do when your ant colony starts to outgrow their test tube and foraging area. Okay, I wish you all the best, and I will see you in the next one.